Good afternoon and welcome back to the live stream. Thank you for joining me. I do hope you're having a good day today. I'm feeling pretty alright this week, I think. Had a very relaxing weekend. I don't know if anybody saw, but Victoria 3 had a free weekend, so I decided, you know what, I play so many Paradox games, I play all their other grand strategy games, why not give this one a try as well? I had played Victoria 2 a long time ago and frankly just didn't like it. It was simply not a game of interest to me. But recently, with all of the stuff I've been seeing about Europa Universalis 5 and all of the intricacies of trade and pop system and stuff like that, and being surprisingly on board with it, I figured, hey, maybe Vicky 3 has done this all a little better than it did, and I might enjoy that one a bit more. I sat down with it, played, I'm not sure how many hours, quite a few, spent the weekend on it, and man, I just don't like it. It's a good game, I think, in a lot of ways. I can see where the appeal comes from in aspects of its resource management. Unfortunately, I just don't think that resource management fits into the wider framework of a grand strategy game, the likes of which Victoria 3 is. One of the reasons why I feel pretty positively so far about what we've seen of EU5 is because I think EU5 is incorporating those elements without forgetting that it is a grand strategy game and needs to provide the grand strategy gameplay experience, which is primarily focused around warfare. Vicky 3 is focused around resources and productions and buildings, with warfare and diplomacy kind of seemingly tacked on as a thing you can spend that ever-growing GDP on, and it just wasn't that fun. It didn't make for interesting gameplay, unfortunately. I feel like the people who complain so much about blobbing in EU4 and who are so concerned about how easy or hard it will be to conquer stuff in EU5 almost want to be playing a different game than what they're actually playing. It's a similar thing that I see with CK3. You know, I watch One Proud Bavarian, and his videos on CK3 are often so fascinating to me because I feel like when he looks at CK3, he sees a fundamentally different game than what I see when I look at it. And the things he wants, the changes he's looking for, are going in a fundamentally different direction, and one that I don't think would be good for the game overall, because it would lose the aspects of the grand strategy that are so core to making this experience work. There's a reason why endlessly since its release, and how long ago was that now? When did Victoria 3 come up? Because we're fairly far into it at this point, aren't we? Yeah, Victoria 3 is from 2022, so we're 3 years in now, and still, since release and continuing on to the present day, one of the most consistent and recurring complaints I see about Victoria 3 is the warfare system, and how at the start there weren't individual armies you could command around, and now there are, but you still don't have that much control over them, and yeah, people don't like it. They want EU4 style armies that they can move around and actually fight with. And I totally get why. It's because the grand strategy game find a lot of their DNA, a lot of of their builds and the systems they draw on in RTS games and in 4X games. And just a huge part of that is the conquest, the expansion. I feel like also specifically for these games, it's an aspect of the model of how they actually work. If these were turn-based games, Civ style, with a big focus on economics instead of any sort of conquest, or with conquest as a secondary idea, that could work. But the grand strategy games are also real-time strategy games, and you need something you can do once you unpause. You know, it can be very fun. I see the appeal I don't even know how long after launching the game as Japan, going through all of the tabs in the settings and rearranging things and planning out what buildings there would be and all that kind of stuff. And there were aspects of that were really, really good, like deciding, checking through the different population groups in each government party, seeing what they spent their money on and imposing tariffs on those things to deny those specific parties of money to weaken them so you can put someone else into government. Fantastic, I love it. But at some point, you have to unpause so that all your buildings can be built and all the stuff that you've set up can actually play out. And at that point, you're bored because you're sitting there doing nothing. And in other games, like EU4 or CK3 to some extent as well, the stuff that you're doing when you unpause is you're directing your units around you and you're conducting warfare. And I think that is an absolutely central, essential pillar to making these sort of games good. Without that, it just doesn't work. It could work, but not in the framework of a real-time game that plods along. In a turn-based game, sure. In a narrative-based game where you're expanding action points or whatever to signal time passing, in anything that isn't running real-time, I could see it. In this, you gotta have something that you're actually doing once you unpause that isn't just waiting for buildings to build so that you can then pause again and set up the next round of stuff. I spent way too much time in these games at speed 5 staring at the screen waiting for the next thing I needed to do. At any rate, that is maybe a little bit of a tangent. We are not here today to discuss my thoughts on grand strategy games, though believe me, when EU5 comes out there will be streams for that. We are here today to do some world building. So let me head on over to here and let's get started on this. So the focus of today is going to be thinking about tech systems. I've done a lot of thinking about magic in previous streams. We've done a lot of focus recently on a specific narrow slice of magic in a little cult city of Twins Cross, and I need a little bit of variety here and there. I've been watching recently the video series by Mandalore Gaming about the Marathon games, spurred on by me reading a Cyberpunk Edgerunners fanfiction that halfway through suddenly transitioned into being a Cyberpunk Marathon crossover unexpectedly. So I wanted to get a little bit of a look on the lore for those games, and it's got me in the mood for some tech stuff. And what I was thinking about was how you define different systems of technology in a sci-fi, or not even necessarily sci-fi, but in a non-magic, but still non-mundane world. Because magic has this very clear, at least in a modern era, magic has this very clear language and philosophy in regards to magic systems, right? In fantasy, you have magic systems. So, for example, in terms of some sort of common types, you've got elemental magic. That's a super popular one, and surprisingly, because of elemental schools of thoughts that we had previously, like in alchemy or in Chinese, I think it's called Wuran, their elemental cycle, where they include different elements. Like instead of the alchemical earth, air, water, fire, they've got earth, metal, wood, fire, water. I can't remember what order they're in, but yeah, different elemental cycle. Between those and the popularity of like Avatar as a show, elemental magic is a very, very popular one. Then you also have the very clearly defined, very clearly understood magic systems that authors have come up with. So, for example, Allomancy from Brandon Sanderson, the kind of poster child for magic systems. which have a very, how to put this, they have an overarching thought process behind them. People understand what you mean when you talk about a magic system. Comparatively, if you want to talk about sci-fi tech systems, what are we talking about here? Mostly, when it comes to sci-fi, they're mostly defined by genres rather than specific sorts of magic, right? You have steampunk or cyberpunk, you have mechs, stuff like that. These are really more genres than they are tech systems, and they also, like, they carry across worlds similarly, but they're really more design choices. You can have very, very different types of what actual technology exists in each of these. So for example, for cyberpunk, something like the Sandevistan time manipulation device that you have in Cyberpunk 2077 and Edgerunners is not something you're going to have in every cyberpunk universe. Some of them are way more high-tech or low-tech than others. Whereas if you have an elemental magic system, each world will define its own elements to a certain extent, but the differences and similarities are different than the differences and similarities between genres, and they also don't come with the same expectations, right? Like, a cyberpunk setting is by necessity, by definition, different than just a more generic sci-fi setting. Whereas elemental magic you can put into any kind of story system. Elemental magic doesn't define anything else about your story. So do we then have... tech systems separate from genre? And I think to a certain extent we do, and it comes to specific types of technology that you can focus a story around or focus your world building around in a similar way to magic systems. I might want to put a few more examples up here just to make it clearer what kind of stuff I'm talking about, like rune magic, magic circles, imagination, summoning. So as pacts and contracts could fit under summoning. Right, you get the idea. Each of these are something that could be an entire magic system on its own. They're often included as things you can do in a broader magic system that has multiple of them, but on their own, they are a thing already. If you tell someone that you've got a high fantasy heroic journey with an elemental magic system, that tracks. You could also have a urban fantasy detective story with an elemental magic system, and it still works. Whereas if you tell someone that you've got cyberpunk, then what does that really tell you about the technology? It gives you certain expectations. You would imagine there's going to be cybernetics, there's going to be prosthetics, that kind of stuff. But what about beyond that? How exactly are they going to work? How fancy are they? There's a lot less details. These are story genres. They tell you much more about what kind of world you're in than anything else. To a certain extent, what kind of aesthetic, because these two really are very heavily built around looks in the modern world rather than details of the technology of a story. That's something that people have very long arguments about, whether something should count as cyberpunk if it just has that kind of futuristic Japanese aesthetic to it, or whether it needs to actually tell a cyberpunk style story. But coming back to that, do we have tech systems separate from genre? Possibly. Cybernetics could count as one. Those are a type of technology. biotech, I think, to a certain extent, is its own sort of thing. I think mechs are also a tech system. A very malleable one. I think mecha, maybe as the anime kind of genre, is a bit more constrained, a bit more defined, but mechs in general, if you're playing Lancer compared to Battletech, you're in a very different sort of game, right? Overall, these are both mech games, but they're very different kind of mech games. Mech is just the tech system, and the implications it carries is there's going to be giant walking robots that people can pilot from inside of them. Nothing closer beyond that, no story expectations, in a similar way that how summoning magic doesn't define what you're summoning and what the costs are and anything like that. It's just like, okay, so there's going to be summoning magic. Do I have something here? I don't know. This is a lot of my streams are very figure it out as we go along. I have put forward an idea and then partway through gone, yeah, actually I don't think there's anything here, or actually I don't think this works the way that I thought it did going into it. So we're discovering this here together, whether there's actually a conversation to be had about magic systems versus tech systems and how much either of them apply. I do remember watching a video some time ago by... oh, who was it from? Yinka, I think, on YouTube, probably. He did a video talking about technology systems in sci-fi and the differences between that and tech levels in the story, that kind of thing. I can't remember the exact details of it, it was a while ago. I should probably rewatch that to refresh myself on some other opinions on the matter. It's always very good to get more input or see if somebody else has already thought of and put what you're thinking into words. So, tech systems, do we have any more? What kind of technologies are almost a category unto themselves? Because of course, if you just have a generic far future sci-fi setting, you would expect to a certain extent all of these to be present, right? Like, all of technology has advanced over time is the general assumption. Which I think is fairly similar to how it is for high fantasy. If you've got a very high power magic setting, there is a little bit of an expectation that magic is just kind of this thing and you can do whatever with it. You might sort your magic into schools and such, and some might be mutually exclusive from each other, but generally speaking, magic can do whatever you need magic to do, with no real restrictions. But individual ones are still distinct enough and have enough flavor within them that people use them as categories all on their own. And I think these fit into that. So for example, for biotech, there are several settings and worlds where technology purely focused around messing with biology has advanced super far, but the rest of the technology is still pretty much at a modern standard. It's only the biotech that's been advancing these stories, and we as an audience are kind of willing to buy that to a certain extent. Maybe because of the complexity involved, or maybe just because biotech is so broad and versatile that that we're willing to accept it as a tech system similar to a magic system that an entire story can be focused around. I think some of that is also visible in the classic RTS trifecta, the biotech, industrial, and alien trifecta. So you've got, for example, in StarCraft, you've got the Zerg, the Terrans, and the Protoss, representing these sort of three branches, where one is pure biology and evolution and DNA editing. One is our understanding of technology, but scaled up to a sci-fi kind of to a sci-fi level, right? You get bigger guns, bigger explosions, that kind of stuff. And then the alien approach, where it's all weird tech, force fields and laser beams and stuff like that. You get not quite the same thing, but similar in Command and Conquer, where you've got one aggressive one. Is it the aggressive and balanced faction? The GDI is balanced, not as aggressive, and then the... Oh god, how long has it been since I played Command and Conquer? The Scrim? Is that what they would call the aliens? With all their shields and lasers and stuff like that? I think so. But you get what I'm talking about here, right? The sort of split, where each of these is considered broad enough on its own to cover all of the needs of that faction and put them all on equal footing with each other, while still being a very distinct tech system. So what is an actual conclusion that we draw from this? Is there a deeper thought behind this? How would I define a magic system, really? What makes a magic system a magic system, rather than just how magic works and what sets it apart from technology, right? A magic system is a set of rules that magic in a particular world follows. Some magic systems are unique to their worlds, but some follow principles of a broader school/approach to magic that is recognizable across different works. This is different from their simply being magic active in the world. Spirited Away, for example, has magic and potential, even rules, but not magic system. I think that's a fair comment to make overall, right? Like, you can, from a world building perspective, from a broad perspective, Spirited Away is soft magic versus hard magic, but it's not a soft magic system. A soft magic system still has rules to a certain extent. It still has a recognizable expectation set for what you can and can't do and how it can or cannot be done. Spirited Away has a couple of examples of certain things, right? Where we can, for example, see that No-Face can't seemingly make real stuff out of nothing. He makes fake gold. But that's not really the basis for any sort of system. There's no why. You could read into the philosophy of it. You can make all sorts of interpretations about the intended meaning of that in the story and how it plays into the themes and such. But there's no actual rule or system. You can't infer what another creature might be able to do based off of No-Face not being able to summon gold. The fact that everyone falls for it, all of those magical beings in the Hot Springs, implies that either they don't know anything about magic, or it is possible for certain creatures to make something like gold out of thin air. or maybe not even make it out of thin air, maybe they just assume that he's rich and was pulling this out of a storage space or something like that. But the key point is that those are guesses, those are pure guesses, because there isn't a magic system here to base any educated guesses off. And that, I think, is an important difference. In some stories, the nature and function of magic isn't important. It's just something that exists as part of the world. On the flip side, then, sure, we can come over there. On the flip side, then, technology. A tech system is... And then what is a tech system? I think one of the things, and something that I think I remember Yinka talking about in his video as well, that really sets apart this kind of theory crafting and this kind of world building in fantasy versus sci-fi, is that when it comes to technology, we are not changing the fundamental rules. The system part of it all already exists in our real-world laws of physics. We already have a system, and we don't generally tend to break the rules of that system. We stretch them and we interpret or extrapolate potential additional rules to sit on top of what we already have. So, for example, light is the fastest thing in the universe. You can't go faster than light. Unless, in a sci-fi setting, you circumvent that somehow. You have wormholes that actually mean you're just going from one space to an adjacent space, even though those spaces also happen to be light years apart. Or you compress space in front of you so that you're only traveling at a reasonable speed, even though your relative position is changing rapidly. Whether those things are possible is currently not possible to say. There are good arguments to be made for it not being so, but one of the core things you start to realize as you look into more advanced physics is that we don't even know how much we don't know, and lots of it is up for interpretation. So you can have some leeway in making up new rules for sci-fi, even on things that are fairly solidly established. Or for example, time travel. There isn't really a lot of interpretations of time travel that make any sort of sense when you start to scrutinize them more closely. However, you can make it make internal sense, and then just kind of go from there without thinking about the consequences too far, and you can even do that without horribly breaking existing laws of physics. You've just got to add some new theoretical rules on top of that. You can even take an existing theory, hypothesis for how things might actually work in real life that just hasn't been proven or disproven yet. I think that pretty much is how a lot of sci-fi FTL came about, because a lot of early sci-fi just wasn't really concerned that much with questions of how long it takes to travel somewhere, and then we get into physics and relativity and quantum physics and the stretching of space-time around gravity, and suddenly authors go, okay, well that's some interesting room that we can play in there, and you get all sorts of forms of FTL. Let me just take a sip from my drink real quick. But yeah, so the difference remains basically that in magic systems you can make stuff up whole cloth. In a tech system, you are only ever building on top of the existing rules of physics and our understanding of technology, which means these kind of tech tend to just be extensions and logical conclusions of existing things. They're stuff we already have, but better. So a tech system is a set of rules that build on or expand the existing laws of physics. They tend to be better versions of things we already have. Extrapolations of what might be possible and logical conclusions of what should be possible. As a result, a lot of tech systems are basically a what if scenario where you take a field of science and try to think about how it would look if you used it. Everything. There we go. Right, like again coming back to biotech. What if you replaced all of technology with living things altered to fulfill those functions? That's basically a biotech system. What if instead of having all sorts of tanks and vehicles and cranes for construction and all manner of other stuff, you got rid of all of that and you just made very big metal people to build things by hand? Cybernetics. What if instead of having all sorts of robots and drones and all kinds of stuff, you just grafted all of those things onto human beings? That kind of thing. What if, for like laser kind of stuff, force fields and stuff, well, first of all, what if they those things worked, and what if they were just better than all the alternatives? You, instead of armoring your ships, put shields on them. You have force field projectors for cables and stuff like that, or as barriers to keep out vacuum so you can have your ships flying in and out of the space station and stuff like that. It's just taking an idea and then extrapolating as much as possible. How could you use this for everything? Which kind of mirrors the magic systems, where it's, if this is the only thing that exists, this is the only type of magic there is, then you have to use it for everything, and you naturally do that part. Potentially to a certain extent there's also an element of how do you put, there's an element of how do you translate magic into sci-fi, which we see in stuff like psionics, clairvoyance, put on the same line here. Psionics, clairvoyance, see lots of mind telekinesis. These ones kind of managed to slip into sci-fi despite their ostensibly magical nature, because our extreme lack of understanding mind and conscious, which means there's really no way to say what is or isn't possible. But like, even if it's not, and I really need to settle on one way of spelling sci-fi, even if it's not theoretically flip into sci-fi despite their yes, even if it's not technically speaking very sensible or realistic to claim that if we just push the human mind far enough we'll be able to warp reality with our thoughts, the fact that we have so little understanding of what and how draws the line between an inanimate object and a consciousness makes it a really easy spot to expand on and make all sorts of outlandish claims, because we just simply don't know whether this kind of stuff might be possible. In other places, it's easier to say, no, that's not sensible, not realistic, because it's just another field of technology and there's no strong pushback. But when it comes to consciousness, it's quite understandable that when you look at yourself and your own mind and the way you think and how all of that works and feels, it's really difficult not to assume that there must be more to it, that there must be some deeper nature to how all of this works that would potentially interact with reality on a more fundamental level. Just because otherwise, how do you even explain the subjective experience of consciousness? Like, I don't know how it is for other people, but for me, sitting here in my own head, it's almost impossible to comprehend that you could potentially, put together a computer, switch it on, and have it have this same experience of being present, of sensation, of stuff like that. Which is why we get psionics and clairvoyance and telekinesis and mind powers in lots and lots of sci-fi, and which is why they managed to get categorized as sci-fi instead of pure fantasy. Now, some people will argue about that. Some people will, for example, call Dune science fantasy, and I think in some ways, in terms of its presentation, they are correct. In some ways, in terms of how realistic the actual technology in it is, also correct. I think you could argue that one way or another, especially if you take into account the time it was written in and the knowledge of technology then. Even if it wasn't too different from now, it was still different. But I think if you come in and you argue that no, the voice and all those mental powers are clearly magic, I don't think that's the case. I think it's actually very much reasonable to argue that psionics are valid under the umbrella of sci-fi. Now, there probably should be a level you constrain that to. There should be an upper limit of how ridiculous you're allowed to get with your mind powers before someone goes, hey, actually maybe that is just magic. Maybe that shouldn't be classified under sci-fi. But I wouldn't be the one to tell you where exactly to draw that line. Similar to that, similar to psionics, godlike AI, there is a certain amount of almost expectation that a supercomputer AI would be able to just, by its mere existence, by its presence, its unknowable eldritch calculations, be able to bend reality. And I think that pretty much comes from the same place as the psionics. Comes from the same place of wondering about the connection between the mind and the physical world. There is an expectation that a supercomputer far beyond human thought should have abilities beyond the human mind. Personally, I think they're just very, very cool. I love sci-fi settings with digital gods running around. I think they just add to sci-fi very strongly in general. Probably part of why I've been enjoying the little foray into the Marathon universe and its crazy super AIs. Also, what's another story? Necroepilogos have some interesting ones with these supercomputers that are doing something for unknowable reasons. I do look forward to reading more of that story and seeing whether there's ever an answer for that and what that answer might be, because it very much hints early on that we're going to find out later what the machines are up to, or at the very least that we're going to interact with them more closely. So these are the obvious ones. The mind powers of how do you translate magic into sci-fi? Well, here is one area of science where we basically just do not know how on earth you relate the incredible nature of a subjective experience back to the overarching subjective nature of just reducing things down to an equation. I shouldn't say reducing things down, because I see that a lot, this kind of science versus art, science versus spirituality kind of thing, which I think is a complete false dichotomy, and actually there is a lot of fascination and beauty and such to be found in scientific understanding. But it is very difficult to reconcile how we individually feel and experience the world and then just say, oh yeah, this and this neuron is firing here and here, and this chemical is being released, and that's why you feel that way. Okay, but how does the collection of neurons and chemicals result in this experience of me here inside my own head? I should do another stream about this, because I'm getting very sidetracked by thinking about it, and it's really too broad of a topic to get pulled into when I'm trying to think about sci-fi and tech systems. Is there anything else obvious about pulling magic? I mean, broadly related to this kind of spirituality and gods and stuff, the idea of energy beings or pure mind beings that have shed their bodies is also very energy beings and mind beings that have shed their bodies. I think I might want to put this category underneath. There we go. Yeah, energy and mind beings that have shed their bodies are also a big one of bringing a magical aspect into sci-fi without making it straight up magic. Stuff like the Force in Star Wars, I think, is pretty magical, right? Beyond the basic telekinesis, the Force sensing and future sight and the light and dark side of a Force, the struggle for balance and stuff like that. That's all. You've gone beyond sci-fi and mind powers there at that point. You're doing full-on actual magic. Or in Stargate, we had several different species that have transcended their physical bodies and are now energy entities. In Star Trek, stuff like the Q is kind of the end point of all of these concepts. A species that has advanced so much that they can do anything, and all of that power and I guess technology and improvements to the self are incorporated into individual entities that can just do whatever. Besides that, anything else? No, I think most other things fit into the actual sci-fi label. Like how would you translate anything else here? Elemental magic. You could have psionics that can summon forth elements, but that's a magic system. If you try to tell me that the people in your sci-fi setting have psionic abilities that allow them to control the 4 classical elements, I'm calling that magic. You're gonna have to put some serious work in to convince me that I'm not looking at magic. Runes and magic circles and stuff like that. The aesthetic gets borrowed now and then with computers and stuff, with circuitry, but that's just the aesthetic, not really the functionality or the actual source of power. Imagination is just the energy beings. Summoning and stuff doesn't really fit into things. Pacts and contracts, not really a thing in sci-fi. Yeah, I think anything beyond that, not so much. Physical things, very difficult to put into sci-fi and not have be magic, and generally speaking unnecessary, right? You don't need to be a firebender in a sci-fi setting, you have a flamethrower. You don't need to be a metal bender, you've got forges and guns or whatever if you want to attack someone with it. Not necessary. It's pretty much the mind stuff, the essence of the self, that lets you stretch the narrower definitions of what's possible in sci-fi. Anything else to this section? Anything else that could count as a tech system? I'm sure there are more. I remember when I was doing some preliminary research for this stream, I'm pretty sure I saw a few people discussing similar things. I might be able to find the post again. I think I have it in my history somewhere over here. This? No, not that. This or this? Nah. This is part of why I make my videos on YouTube. The process of research is so difficult sometimes, but I just wish to spare other people from having to crawl through endless Reddit threads trying to figure out whether someone has had the same idea before. Oh, nanotech. Yes, that's a good one as well. Nanotech. Again, under the same kind of broad, the conclusion we've come to down here of tech systems being take one field of study and then see if you can extrapolate how to apply it to everything. Nanotech is a very good candidate for that. It's kind of fallen out of fashion a little recently, I feel. I think it used to be much bigger. There was this expectation kind of 10-ish years ago that nanotechnology and the ability to make everything smaller and smaller would revolutionize tech within the next 10 years. And I mean, there's been some progress made, but it hasn't really done that. But for sci-fi, definitely, nanotech is a very flexible one as far as tech systems go, because you can really do everything with it, right? The ability to deconstruct and reconstruct and alter things as they are in motion is really, really strong for a not magic system, for a tech system. We see it a lot with overlapping with biotech, in that you use the nanotech to go into a body and alter it on like a cell-by-cell level to achieve whatever result. But I feel like when a nanotech is available, you don't often get the biological edits. You get nanotech used for healing and for enhancing, like making a body tougher or whatever, but you're not getting limb replacements or whatever, that kind of stuff, because they're very different approaches, very different aesthetics. I think this is probably the thought that brought me onto this entire topic in the first place. This idea you can observe of different sorts of technology being separated out into their own categories in the same way that we separate out magic systems. even though they don't work quite the same, even though they don't serve exactly the same purpose in the story, I do think that they are worth considering as their own thing. And I think it's an interesting question to look at. What is a tech genre under the sci-fi umbrella, and what is really a tech magic system? Because they carry very different baggage. I might want to look into this as far as magic systems are concerned as well at some point. I don't think that there are as many that are constrained for magic systems, really, because magic, if you look at magic genres, they really concern themselves very heavily with the where and when and how to a pretty great extent. Right, like urban fantasy versus high fantasy versus sword and sorcery, these things all tell you something about the world and what kind of stuff you can expect in the world. And they will influence the magic, but they'll influence how it's implemented, right? Like a sword and sorcery setting tends to be lower power magic, it tends to be a bit more gritty, it tends to have a bit more consequence for your magic, compared to a high fantasy or a heroic fantasy where magic is very powerful and present and can do lots of things for maybe less cost. But what the actual magic is interchangeable. You can have some kind of pact and contract magic in any of these settings. It's just that in the sword and sorcery, you're probably making deals with devils that you'll later come to regret because of the high cost they carry. Whereas in the high fantasy, maybe you're contracting with some kind of elemental companion who will help you along the way and lend you part of their powers. Right? These are very different approaches, and the genre influences which approach you're likely to see, but the actual magic system, genre agnostic. Whereas for technology, steampunk is a genre. Yes, it's an expectation of what kind of technology is in the genre. It's going to be steam, there's going to be pipes and cogs and gears, there's going to be lots of copper and brass around. Sorry, gotta take a drink real quick, my throat hurts a little. Right, as I was saying, with steampunk, you expect far more of how the technology works. And I think partially that makes perfect sense because it is science fiction and technology is kind of the embodiment of science. But it also kind of contrasts with the stuff that is a little bit more genre agnostic, like for example cybernetics. You can totally see a prosthetic arm in any of these genres. In a steampunk one, it will be maybe a little bit more old-fashioned, it will be more limited in what it can do, it might not replace a limb in the same way. But for example, the game Lies of P, where you can do all sorts of funny stuff with your mechanical arm, that's a lot more steampunk. Whereas in Cyberpunk, a mantis blade, perhaps from the Cyberpunk 2077 game, is a very, very different piece of technology. And these are defined by the genres the same way that implementations of magic are defined by the genres, which is why this separation of sci-fi genre of technology and sci-fi tech system. I don't know whether tech system is the correct name to go with here compared to magic system, but I think it's probably the best terminology that I've got for the time being. Besides that, is there any other conclusion to be drawn from this, really? I think I've more or less managed to get what I was thinking about onto the page here. But take out some of these extra spaces, we can even fit it onto a single page, yes. Just about. Yeah, that basically covers this thought that struck me earlier about, does sci-fi have tech systems the same way fantasy has magic systems. I suppose the next question to look into would be implementations of tech systems. You know, what does each of these look like when you look at them through that lens of being a type of power system, I suppose would be the overarching terminology to combine both of them together. Though I feel like if I say power system, that makes me think of superheroes more than it does anything. Actually, that's a point we probably need to address here in terms of this category of bringing the two together. Let's have a whole new section down here. Superheroes. Because the superhero genre of stories takes absolutely everything into it, right? Like if you look at Marvel or DC, superheroes can draw their power from anything. Magic, tech, spirituality, whatever, any sort of power source you can think of, a superhero can have that as the source of their particular abilities. But I feel like in terms of looking at more quote-unquote realistic, non-magical superheroes, they really stretch the boundaries a lot more than anything else, don't they? Like, for example, if you look at the kind of poster boy of superheroes, Superman himself, technically speaking, we should be led to believe that... Let me write that down. Technically speaking, Superman is sci-fi, right? Like, his abilities don't come from magic or whatever. They come from him being a Kryptonian. That is just how their species works. That is what they can do. Due to their biology somehow, metabolizing sunlight apparently leads to them being able to fly at super speeds and all sorts of other fun stuff. Extremely soft sci-fi. Let's make that note here. So what implications does that have for our discussion on fantasy and sci-fi power systems? Does it have any, beyond the fact that if you're willing to make your science essentially a complete hand wave, you can do whatever you want? How far do you want to stretch suspension of disbelief before it really shouldn't be called sci-fi anymore? Can you call extremely soft sci-fi superheroes sci-fi? Should it be soft sci-fi? Is it its own thing? Are superheroes almost by necessity fantasy? Some of them no. If you look at like the Batman movies, really any of them, in isolation, Batman and the villains he fights are not magical, I think. Is there... oh no, what's his name? The vampire? Ra's al Ghul? Isn't he like straight up a magic vampire? But most of them aren't magical. There's always some kind of, even if it's a very loose one, there's always some kind of realistic explanation. Like the Joker goes mad because he gets dunked in a vat of chemicals or whatever. Scarecrow causes people to hallucinate their worst fears because of some chemical that he's created that affects people like that. I think Poison Ivy... oh god, there's been so many iterations, I'm trying to remember now which ones I've watched. I think in one iteration Poison Ivy is like communing with nature magically. In a different one, she also... there's a lot of Batman villains having industrial accidents and getting doused in chemicals that cause them to develop powers. There seems to be a recurring theme here. I think in the only Catwoman movie I've ever watched, she like almost dies and then a cat comes up to her and suddenly she gains cat powers, and there is no explanation offered beyond that. It's just, yeah, you know what, the cats have deemed you worthy, this is a thing you can do now, have fun. Which is definitely on the magical side of things. But mostly, yeah, a lot of superhero stories try to cling on to a certain amount of scientific feasibility. Spider-Man gets his powers from the radioactive spider, and at the time, in the era it was created in, where so little was known about radiation and its effects, that seemed feasible. There was no real reason to say that you couldn't get superpowers from a radioactive spider. What else? I mean, I guess in some of the more recent Spider-Man movies, like all the multiverse stuff, multiverses they're not so much are anymore, but they were a scientific possibility. There was genuinely strongly discussed, and papers were written, and theories were made, and maths was done to see whether we did live in a reality with multiverses and different timelines and stuff that you could travel between. So a lot of that is sci-fi. I think a sub-note here, some allowance needs to be made for older stories. The rapid progress in the last century has significantly changed what counts as reasonable for sci-fi. And that's something I've addressed in multiple streams. It's a topic I keep coming back to and keep bringing up again and again, that as time goes on, what seems realistic and what you can get away with, both in sci-fi and in magic systems, shifts as more knowledge is uncovered and more knowledge becomes common knowledge. So for example, the poster children for difficult things to include in a magic system because they break the story a lot, teleportation and time travel and super speed. As a matter of fact, Overly Sarcastic Productions recently did a video on speedsters, which I highly recommend watching, though a lot of that was on the story implications of the trope rather than the world-building difficulties, but it still did touch on that, so it's a very good video for that as well. Their videos are just very good in general, so always recommend watching OSD. Yeah, those kind of powers and abilities that before we knew more about it seemed very reasonable to give to people, and now that you actually think about it, it's like, oh wait, hang on, the laws of physics means that these things have really, really unfortunate consequences. Another one that I actually haven't brought up before, but that I did think about while watching the Speedster video recently, is invisibility. Used to be, you could just turn a guy invisible and it would be fine. In a magic setting, you kind of still can, because you can just say, yeah, the magic makes it so people can't see him. Don't talk to me about photons and light and stuff, they just can't see him, it's magic. In sci-fi, invisibility is becoming more and more difficult. Nowadays, you tell someone, oh yeah, they've got this technology that turns you invisible, and the person is going to turn around and go, well actually, if they're invisible and the light's passing through them, that would render them blind, because the light is not entering their eyes to enable them to see. That was not a point of discussion that anyone would have brought up in the past. Now, it's something that I've seen multiple times in different conversations about the realism of different powers in magic systems and in sci-fi. So the band of what you can call sci-fi narrows as time goes on. You can probably widen it for yourself by just drawing on different sources. If you make a superhero story, even in the modern day, people are going to allow you to be a lot more open with stuff. Like no one complains when a new Superman movie comes out that it doesn't make sense that he should be able to fly or whatever. They just allow it because it's Superman, and Superman can fly. Sure, he's a Kryptonian, that's how they work. Fast Asynchronicity, thank you for following. And Hope2321, also thank you for following. Nanas, how are you? I am not Nanas. I wish I was that interesting. And I'm doing pretty well, thank you. How are you doing today? Having a good day, I hope? I am ever so slightly slowly dying in my room because it is so hot. The weather's still pretty nice recently, but no longer as sweltering as it was over the weekend, so I've got the window closed because of how loud the road is around this time. Everyone's going home for the evening. But it does mean that it's hot. Yeah, God, it's hot in here. We can manage though. We can pull through. Yeah, genre and type of story does give you a little bit of leeway in terms of what the audience will buy. Could you use that leeway? Can you still call yourself sci-fi if you're banking specifically on genre conventions and not poke holes into the nature of your science? Oh, I use Nanas as a greeting with okay. Winter in Australia. I mean, does Australia get that cold? I couldn't say for certain, but I'm fairly confident it doesn't, like, snow in Australia, does it? I don't know. I've never heard of anyone complaining about snow in Australia. Mostly complaints about spiders. There's that one Tumblr post where someone was complaining about how hot it was, and then it gets completely derailed because apparently people call flip-flops thongs over there. So we get us 4 degrees. I mean, 4 degrees is pretty cold. 4 degrees I think is enough to complain about the weather. You get that one. Anything else about superheroes that we need to tie back into the earlier topics? I don't really know how superheroes fit into the question of tech systems versus magic systems. Right, because superheroes just kind of get powers. A superhero is just like, here's a character, here's a thin pretext for why they can do a certain thing, let's move on to the story. Overall, superheroes don't really fit into power systems. Each one gets a own thing. But then there are also magic systems that function like that, where everyone gets their own special power. Are they still a magic system? I think so. I think they should be a magic system if a system is everyone gets their own thing. It's just not a very well-defined one. Like the Skullduggery Pleasant books, where you've got, you know, your necromancers, elementalists, whatever, and then you just have the adepts whose power is whatever the hell they happen to get. That's still a magic system. Is the random powers that characters get in My Hero Academia a power system? Considering how much they flesh it out with different types of powers and how they interact and like power copying and all of that nonsense and the depth they go into, it really is a power system. It's got rules, even if the rules mostly are just that each individual can do whatever the hell. The Blue Mountains near New South Wales? Snow. So what tech systems are you figuring out? I'm just kind of thinking about tech systems in general. I had a thought earlier about how there's a lot of conversation in fantasy world building circles about magic systems. If you say that you're doing world building for a fantasy world, then you're gonna get questions online about what your magic system looks like. Mostly due to Brandon Sanderson and his articles on the 3 laws of magic and his work with allomancy, and it kind of struck me that there are generic magic systems in fantasy. Like, elemental magic is something you can drop into whatever fantasy story you're building, or whatever fantasy world you're building, and have it make sense. And it will be recognized as an elemental magic system, no matter what specific rules you decide to change about it, whether you use classical Western magical elements, or the Chinese Confucian, I think it's, or Taoist elements. It's still elemental magic. If you add spirit as a 5th element, still elemental magic. For sci-fi, a lot of what technology you have and how it works is defined by the genre you're in. If you've got a space opera, for example, then obviously you're going to have some sort of faster-than-light technology, because space operas play out across planets and star systems. The scale of it is just kind of part of the genre. Do you have generic tech systems in sci-fi? And I feel like the answer is yes. I feel like certain sort of technology, like cybernetics or biotech or nanotech, are generic enough but also large enough that they form a whole framework. You can say you're writing a sci-fi, and when someone asks you what kind of sci-fi is it, like what's making it, what's the fiction part, how far in the future is it, and stuff like that, you can say, oh, it's got really advanced nanotech. And then that answers the question in the same way that saying, oh, it's got elemental magic, answers it for magic systems. You've got nanotech. You've got now a certain expectation of what kind of technology is possible in this world, without the expectation that other stuff also is. Biotech is not required in a nanotech world. Cybernetics are not required, even though in theory they should be super easy to implement with nanotech. But each of these is broad enough and interesting enough to be a system in its own right. So here I'm just writing down all of my thoughts about what makes a tech or a magic system, and do they serve similar functions? Is one the same as the other? Where the hell do superheroes fit into the whole thing? Bryan Sanderson inspired in writing structures. Really enjoy his 7s on YouTube. Yeah, they're very good. I mean, it was, what, a couple months ago he posted the most recent set. Very interesting stuff. I remember watching some of those years ago when I was getting into world building a bit more, and doing it really as a hobby rather than just a random thing that I did sometimes for fun. Which I guess is technically a hobby, but like a proper hobby that I was focused and invested in. Writing structures is an interesting one. I've not looked too much into story structures. You get some very conflicting opinions on how useful they are and how applicable they are. Right, like some people will hold up certain books or whatever talking about the 3-act structure or the hero's journey or whatever, and say, yeah, this really managed to capture what all stories function like, whereas other people will then make entire video essays about, actually, no, this is not how stories work, and this is not applicable to everything, and if you just look a little broader at a few different types of stories, you'll see this doesn't apply at all. I'm not well researched enough in this to have an official opinion on the matter, but I think I would probably argue that while a useful tool for analysis and a useful tool as a guideline if you need one, story structures probably aren't as universal as some people claim. I think probably from the fact that I read a lot of stuff on Royal Road and stuff like that, a lot of web serials which are terribly long with very meandering stories. I've got a lot of experience on stories where structure is kind of a secondary concern. For better or for worse, right? Some benefit from it and being a bit more meandering and having that freedom, and some could maybe benefit from getting to the point every now and then. Coming back to this and the question of how do you translate the magic into sci-fi? Superheroes are probably the biggest answer to that question of how do you translate something that's ostensibly magic into a sci-fi system. But the way that they answer that, the way soft sci-fi answers the question of how to class this as sci-fi is generally to just hand wave everything. Just don't think about it too hard. How does this work? Well, here's something that's vaguely plausible, and we'll just leave it at that. You don't have to know the actual mechanics behind it. We're just going to say that this is how it works and accept it and move on. I think that just about qualifies for being allowed onto the very, very softest end of a sci-fi scale. I think a token effort to at least adhere to some amount of internal consistency allows for that to happen. A lot of it, I think, also still hinges on this entire concept of the mind and thought, and that we're willing to give a lot more leeway to this somewhat unexplored sector of science. Just because of subjective experiences and because we don't know almost anything about the actual relation between the physical, biological hardware we run on and the experience of consciousness, which allows for that gap here where you can have psionic abilities and telekinesis and stuff. Some people will disagree with that. Again, you know, I would personally say that, for example, Star Wars is science fantasy and the Force is magic, whereas Star Trek is extremely soft sci-fi, and the psionics and stuff in that are science-based, even if the science is not very good. Other people will say flat out, no, there's absolutely no way Star Trek is definitely science fantasy, or they will insist that there's enough internal consistency and rules, and enough that we can't strictly say works one way or another about the mind and soul and energy and stuff like that, that actually Star Wars does fit under the sci-fi label. Of course, other people will say that it's completely irrelevant how the actual science bit works. Right? It's not a question of how realistic or how close to real physics is this, it's a question of story and presentation. And in that regard, absolutely, it's all sci-fi, none of it's science fantasy or even actual fantasy. Because if you put in a spaceship or whatever, then, you know, that's clearly pretty sci-fi. The question of realism, I think, is a fairly interesting one when you do get into something that's deliberately science fantasy, and I think there's a lot of very fun space to be played with there. Magic the Gathering has just started dropping spoilers for its next upcoming set, Edge of Eternities, which is a sci-fi set in the fantasy world of MTG, which is a sort of multiverse with a magic system. Magic has 5 different colors of mana, different colors let you do different things better. But what you can actually do with magic is very, very broad. Like, basically, any color of magic can do anything. There's no limits. Like time travel, invisibility, elemental magic, necromancy, it's all possible in the MTG universe. It's a very, very broad magic system with not much in the way of rules, which is now moving into a sci-fi space. What is that going to look like? Something I'm very interested in seeing. I have been very disappointed a lot with Wizards of the Coast and MTG recently in the way they've handled the game and the way they've handled the world with the universes beyond and stuff like that. Not a fan, but I'm still kind of fascinated to see how they're going to pull this off. And I'm hoping it's good, because the concept art, man, the concept art for Edge of Eternities has been stunningly beautiful. I've not enjoyed the last couple tech sets. Kamigawa Neon Dynasty I thought was really generic in its aesthetics. Its cyberpunk was very basic. It really did not manage to take proper advantage of the incredibly unique aesthetic and design of the original Kamigawa. Likewise, Ether Drift was just cyberpunk references the set. Like, okay, cool, we're gonna put Chandra on a bike and have her do the Akira slide, yay. Got anything more original from even that? No, apparently not. Edge of Eternities looks like it might manage to be actually good sci-fi, and I'm, despite my better judgment, I am quite excited to see what the future brings in that regard. But in regards to magic systems versus tech systems, a science fantasy universe that is so thoroughly magical as the MTG setting, kind of, like, can it put itself onto the sci-fi soft to hard spectrum? Does that even apply in something like this? Because we've got, for example, like technology. You know, Dominaria had some very advanced tech. We've got things that could be spaceships, like the what's it called, the Weatherlight, which is a flying ship. And flying ships in space isn't a new thing. Like, Wizards of the Coast also has Dungeons and Dragons, and Spelljammer is a setting that is science fantasy space travel. But Edge of Eternities doesn't look like it's doing that. Edge of Eternities, looking at the art we've gotten so far, the spaceships they've shown off, they look very technological. So I'm very curious to see, assuming that it even gets addressed in the set at all, because it might not, right? The cards only have so much room for flavor text, and the stories they publish alongside are usually pretty focused on the characters, not on expanding the details of the system, of the settings, magic or tech systems. But if they do expand on it, I am fascinated to see whether they choose to make this a full lean into the tech sci-fi set. Are there going to be spacesuits and issues of gravity and how the FTL works and stuff like that? Or are we going to sidestep that kind of stuff? It is called Edge of Eternities because it's related to the Blind Eternities, which is the space between dimensions in Magic the Gathering. So there's a lot of potential there to just sidestep any sort of sci-fi issues very cleanly. To just say, oh, the space travel at faster than light speed works because we're traveling outside of reality and that kind of stuff. They might not address it. If they do, I might do a live stream talking about entirely that because it would be fascinating. Let me just take a sip real quick. To pull back from fangirling over a game that I theoretically stopped playing years ago, and come back to the core concept here of, do we have, like, the initial question that we're set out to answer, which I should probably put at the top here for future reference, was can you look at tech systems in sci-fi the same way we look at magic systems in fantasy? And I would answer, overall the conclusion we've come to here is yes. I think they function a little bit differently. The borders of what's reasonable and what isn't are different, and the presentation matters a lot. And as we kind of put it down here, the implementation of how you get to a tech system is a bit different, whereas magic systems are based a lot on our real life traditions of magic, of what people have historically thought might or was possible. You know, ideas of elemental powers or necromancy or summoning things from beyond and stuff like that, and magic rituals and circles. That serves as the inspiration for a lot of magic systems, whereas tech systems are more of a what-if expansion, which makes a lot of sense for the genre itself, right? Like, science fiction is, as a genre, built on the extrapolation of what might the world look like in the future, or what might a made-up world in a different spot of its technological progression look like compared to ours. So it makes sense that tech systems compared to magic systems will also be extrapolations of what the world looks like now expanded. You take a particular field of science, like for example nanotech or biotech, and you grow that out into something that could be applied in every part of life. And that's how you end up with a tech system. The specific for-world made-up ones are a little bit of a different story. For fantasy, stuff like allomancy and all sorts of other magic systems are a lot more malleable, should we say. There's a lot more. You can just say, hey, this thing is possible now, and here's how you do it, and there you've got a magic system. Right, like if you say, oh, in the Inkheart universe, certain people can read a story out loud, and the act of doing so causes things to be brought in or out of the world of the story. And then that's just a magic system, that's how it works. There's no more questions or debates about it or whatever. If I look over to my left to my bookshelves, what's another one? The Septimus Heap series by Angie Sage. There's a part of a magic system in there that the way spells work and certain charms work is the first time a mage comes up with a spell completely spontaneously, they quickly scribble it down on whatever item they have available, and then those items become charms you can use to cast that spell. So for example, the example the story uses is if you have a mage who happens to come up with a cool spell while they're eating breakfast, you might have that spell etched into a bunch of slices of toast because that's what they happen to have on hand. They need multiple of the same object to imbue the spell into, which is very interesting. The system doesn't define beyond that what's possible. You can do basically anything with magic. But it does define this particular part, and that, combined with a few other rules that are set in over the course of the series, gives you a magic system. For sci-fi, you basically either have to stick to reasonable science to a certain extent, or you have to go full into handwave territory. You can have an existing technology like prosthetics or cybernetics, and then expand, well, what if these were way better in the future? Or you go, hey, everybody gets their own power and it just kind of functions, or hey, this entire species can do this particular thing because their biology metabolizes some energy in a particular way that we're not going to get into too terribly. And then it's just like, well, that's not really how anything works, and I'm not sure whether we should really call this sci-fi, but you're making a little bit of an effort, so I guess we let you get away with it, right? It's the absolute very, very softest of sci-fi, but it is, in spirit at least, still sci-fi. I think I probably personally lean on somewhat of a middle ground as far as the question of, is sci-fi defined by the feasibility of what happens inside it versus is sci-fi defined by the presentation of what happens within it? Right, like I think the new Magic the Gathering set is a sci-fi set, even if it's in a science fantasy world. The second part of the sentence just completely disappeared out of my head. Oh well. I was gonna say more on that, but it's vanished. Yeah, like I think the barrier to entry for sci-fi shouldn't be purely based on the feasibility of a technology. Partially because we can argue endlessly over what technology is feasible. It's becoming more and more accepted in scientific circles that various sorts of circumventions for FTL travel just aren't feasible. You know, stuff like compressing space or wormholes or whatever, which looked really reasonable and sensible like 10 years ago, more and more are becoming a thing that scientists look at and go, yeah, there were theories about this, but it's looking like actually no, you can't do this. The speed of light is a hard limit that you can't circumvent in any way. But we also just don't know. So as long as you're willing to say, hey, here's kind of an explanation, you still get let into the sci-fi club. You're not hard sci-fi if you've got FTL travel, but you are sci-fi, and you can get to medium if you're willing to do everything else sensibly enough. Like, I think the engine they use in The Expanse is loosely based on a real scientific principle, but doesn't actually work in practice. Like, we can't actually build one in the real world. Or, oh no, hang on, because I remember looking this up on the wiki at some point. It's some kind of like nuclear powered engine that isn't actually real, but it lets, by just hand waving that one detail and saying here's how we generate enough power for these ships to go the way they do, The Expanse is then able to go super hard on the science in almost every other aspect, like taking into account how low gravity will cause bodies to develop differently, and how the ships burn for half a journey and then flip around and burn opposite to decelerate for the other half, because that is the fastest way to traverse around space if you don't have warp engines or whatever. So you can take a starting point and say, here specifically is where we break science, but then we're going to use that as a building block for hard sci-fi everywhere else, and the audience will generally speaking accept that. And why wouldn't they? Because it makes for great stories, and that kind of extrapolation is really what makes sci-fi so fascinating in a lot of ways. With all of that being said, I think I've reached the end of what I can extract out of this particular question, and more and more of the stuff I'm saying about it is leaning into other topics of conversation that's around this idea. So probably gonna call that one to an end here. I did consider whether I would launch into doing a little bit of sci-fi world building after this conversation topic, but I think I will save that for a different stream. I'm still planning to continue on the urban fantasy world building project in Twins Cross. That's definitely going to continue. Probably the next bit I'm moving on to will be making up some characters who can be part of all of these organizations we've built. I might make a couple more magical groups off stream and then fill out what they do and who's a member on stream later on. But I have also been feeling a little bit of the pull of sci-fi recently, and I think 2 concurrent world-building projects is probably not too much of a stretch. We can flip back and forth a little bit between sci-fi and fantasy. For now, however, I shall thank you all very much for watching and joining me today. Nice to get some more followers. We're creeping ever closer to the follower goal. Though of course I do believe Twitch recently changed the rules and you no longer actually need 50 concurrent followers for Twitch affiliate. I think it's like half that now, but you need more concurrent viewers or something like that. I'm not sure. Either way, we're a ways off, but I look forward with great fervor to the day when I can finally use my emotes on Twitch. Until then, thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you all next time.